Well, the United States Senate just capitulated to Obama and don't believe anything else, and I'll explain why in just a moment. I am Mark Levin. Welcome. Our number, 877-381-3811. The United States Senate just rewrote the treaty provision of the Constitution. It just rewrote the treaty provision of the Constitution, which is what I talk about all the time, how these people in Washington, D.C. usurp the Constitution all the time. And yet when I talk about an Article 5 Convention of the States, oh, we're going to have a runaway convention, oh, this, that, and the other, oh, don't you support the Constitution? And this may be over the heads of most commentators and people on TV and radio, but it's not over my head and it won't be over yours. The treaty provision of the Constitution, Article 1, Section 2, Clause 2, could not be clearer. The President shall have power by and with the advice and consent of the Senate to make treaties, provided two-thirds of the senators present concur. Provided two-thirds of the senators present concur. That is, they either voted up or voted down. It's a supermajority of senators present. Now, why did they do that? Well, Alexander Hamilton tells us why they did it in Federalist 75, as I've talked about since last summer. The history of human conduct does not warrant that exalted opinion of human virtue which would make it wise in a nation to commit interests of so delicate and momentous a kind as those which concern its intercourse with the rest of the world to the sole disposal of a magistrate, created and circumstanced as would be a president of the United States. This crucial power must not belong to one man, to a president. It must be shared. And Hamilton went on to point out, though it would be imprudent to confide in him solely so important a trust, talking of the president, yet it cannot be doubted that his participation would materially add to the safety of the society. It must indeed be clear to a demonstration that the joint possession of the power in question by the President and Senate would afford a greater prospect of security than the separate possession of it by either of them. So it's a dual obligation by the men who created these bodies and this federal government in the first instance. And yet Bob Corker, the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, is walking around today like a rooster. Great accomplishment. Even got Barbara Boxer to vote for it. To vote for what? To vote for what? You see, ladies and gentlemen, the way it's supposed to work, something this momentous, something this crucial in changing the relationship, quote unquote, between the United States and Iran requires more than an executive action. It requires more than a statute. It certainly requires more than the UN. It requires a treaty. A treaty that the Senate can vote up or down, approve or disapprove. That's the way the process is supposed to work. But it won't work in this instance for several reasons. Number one, you see in the last weeks this phony framework where Obama, our supreme leader, and Iran's supreme leader are saying two different things about the same framework. Our imperial, lawless president and their Islamo-Nazi leader can't even agree on what they supposedly agreed on. That's number one. Number two, your United States Senate, with a majority of Republicans, 54 Republicans, vote us in, we'll repeal Obamacare. They didn't. We'll cut spending. They didn't. We'll secure the border. They won't. Oh, now what we need is a president. What? Jeb Bush. Your Republican Senate has utterly and completely capitulated. I don't care if it's unanimous or not. Now, as best as we can tell right now, this deal with this Corker and Lindsey Graham, I might add, Congress gets to review the deal for 30 days after June 30. And unless Congress rejects it, requiring 60 votes up front and 67 to override a presidential veto, 60 votes up front to overcome a filibuster, Obama can lift sanctions any time after that 30-day period. So, we've turned the treaty provision on its head. Instead of requiring 2/3 of the senators present to approve the treaty, this bill explicitly, with Obama's blessing, he's pretending that, oh, I'm not that comfortable, but I'll take it, that you need 67 votes to override a presidential veto, to undo what Obama's done. Am I making sense, Mr. Producer? Are you able to follow this? All right, so it's been turned around. It's been turned on its head. Now we need a supermajority to override the president, rather than a supermajority where the president needs approval for a treaty. The Republican Senate has no more respect and faith for our Constitution than the Democrat president. They're in it together. They also stripped the provisions, had been discussed earlier, requiring Obama to certify every 90 days after sanctions are lifted that Iran is not engaging in terrorist activities. The White House said that provision would have been impossible to uphold. So why are we in this at all? Think just for a moment. Step back from all the static, all the yik-yak. Let me ask you a question. We are entering into an arrangement, ultimately on June 30th, with a terrorist regime. The word terrorism or terrorist under international law has meaning. It has meaning. The Geneva Convention that relates to terrorism is explicit that terrorists and terrorist states are so thoroughly lawless, they're not to be treated, even in a state of war, as you do an enemy. Terrorists are not to be treated as prisoners of war. They're so loathsome to humanity and society. So here we are, soon to enter into some kind of deal with the Islamo-Nazi terrorist regime in Tehran. Terrorists because they won't follow the rules of war laid out in the Geneva Conventions. And yet somehow they're going to follow the rules of this deal, which is nebulous and ambiguous, where our imperial lawless president and their Islamo-Nazi leader cannot even agree on what they supposedly agreed on in this framework. And now the Republicans have participated. The chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, this Bob Corker, who's way over his head, with the assistance of Lindsey Graham, have come up with language that's so outrageous, so weaselly, that even Barbara Boxer has thrown in. Because they got the go-ahead from Obama, who the New York Times has reported is prepared to sign this bill. Of course he is. All this bill does is give cover to the Congress, where they can pretend that they're doing something substantive. They can pretend that they're doing something serious. They can pretend they actually have a role in overseeing sanctions, when in fact, your Republican Senate will never be able to cobble together 60 votes to override to override a filibuster, or certainly 67 votes to override a presidential veto, should the Congress decide that enough is enough and there needs to be sanctions. The whole process has been turned around. It's been turned on its head. Bob Corker and the Republican Senate has just dragged the Republican Congress into a disaster. And your Republican Congress is happy to support it because it's a fig leaf. One more time. Rather than the president needing 67 votes, or that I should say more accurately, 2/3 of senators present to vote for his treaty, now it's going to take 60 votes to stop him. And if they get that 60 votes and overcome a filibuster, it's going to take 67 votes to override his veto. The entire treaty clause has been turned over on its head, and the United States Senate has not only, in this instance at least, whitewashed the treaty power out of the Constitution, it has made it impossible for the Republican Senate to stop Obama. 3 cheers for Bob Corker. 3 cheers for Lindsey Graham. 2 morons. And now you watch as pseudo-conservatives and Republicans all over the place praise this. You watch as the Republican leadership praises this, as they surrender the Constitution to an imperial president who's about to arm up the Islamo-Nazi regime with nukes, with intercontinental ballistic missiles. The Russians see it. Now Putin is going to sell them S-300 missile batteries, the most cutting-edge defensive missile weaponry they have, that will make it incredibly difficult for not only the Israelis to hit targets within Iran, but should we decide to do so one day, it will tie our hands immeasurably as well. What a complete and utter disaster. How can you have an agreement with a terrorist regime, ladies and gentlemen? The definition of terrorism, in essence, is utter lawlessness, even in times of war. So how do you enter into an agreement with a regime that doesn't adhere to existing agreements, international agreements? This is so bizarre. Our entire nation is getting sucked into Barack Obama's pathetic legacy, and the whole world is being damaged as a result of it. Here's Josh Not Earnest at the White House briefing today. Cut 1, go.
We've had what I could describe as 4 specific concerns with the way the Corker legislation was introduced. The one that I've talked the most frequently about in public is the requirement for the administration to certify that Iran has not backed terrorism against Americans. And this idea that we could essentially get Iran to renounce terrorism is unrealistic.
Well, you know how absurd this is. We are entering into an arrangement with a country that targets Americans for terrorism. And here we have a presidential spokesman saying it is unrealistic to expect them to be otherwise. We should be destroying this regime, not legitimizing it, not empowering it, not helping it nuke up, not ensuring that it has billions and billions of dollars to continue to do what it wants to do. The insanity of what this man just said, the insanity of our policies cannot be overstated. I want you to hear it again. This is a man who's saying it's unrealistic to stop this regime, this terrorist regime, from committing terrorist acts against Americans. Cut 1, go.
We've had what I could describe as 4 specific concerns with the way the Corker legislation was introduced. The one that I've talked the most frequently about in public is the requirement for the administration to certify that Iran has not backed terrorism against Americans. And this idea that we could essentially get Iran to renounce terrorism is unrealistic.
Not just renounce it. We don't want them committing it. And they won't. They won't agree to that. They won't agree to stopping terrorism against Americans. And now your United States Senate, a Republican majority and Democrats, have agreed that that provision of what was this Corker bill should be stripped out. And it was stripped out. A provision requiring Obama to certify every 3 months after lifting sanctions that Iran is not engaging in terrorist activities. The White House said, no deal. Here we have Republicans in the Senate negotiating with Democrats in the Senate and negotiating with the imperial president, negotiating away American national security and the treaty power that the Senate has under the Constitution. And you're supposed to celebrate this. You're supposed to celebrate this. More from this Josh, not Ernest. Cut 2, go.
The proper role for Congress in this effort is the consideration of the sanctions that Congress put in place themselves. And again, if we're able to reach a compromise, which seems to be emerging through the committee, the compromise would set up a vote to vote later on those specific congressional sanctions.
So they would check a box, essentially, to say that it's not an up or down vote anymore on the deal?
That's correct. It would not be an up or down vote on the deal.
He's thrilled. See, that's correct. There is no up and down vote on the deal. In other words, these damn fools in the United States Senate just gave up the treaty power, as they've given up the power of the purse, as they've given up the power over immigration. And you are supposed to think this is a great day and celebrate it. Not me, damn it. You know, folks, just so you don't think it's me putting words in the mouth of this administration, it's important that you hear these clips. I'm not one of these guys that sits here and plays 14 clips, 50 clips, and just starts cracking jokes about them. I do that, can do that from time to time. No, these clips are important. They're history. They're the sad history of the decline of America under Barack Obama. Once again, listen to this clip where he said, Ernest, on behalf of the President of the United States, that it's unrealistic, in essence, to expect the Iranians to stop killing Americans, to stop committing acts of terrorism against Americans. Cut 1, go.
We've had what I could describe as 4 specific concerns with the way the Corker legislation was introduced. The one that I've talked the most frequently about in public is the requirement for the administration to certify that Iran has not backed terrorism against Americans.
Stop! This is the most problematic of them all, he says. The requirement for the administration to certify that Iran has not backed terrorism against Americans. Why are we sitting down with these people instead of blowing them off the face of the earth? This is extremely dangerous, what's going on here. Go ahead.
And this idea that we could essentially get Iran to renounce terrorism is unrealistic.
Well, if they won't renounce terrorism against Americans and it's unrealistic, then you bring out the bombers. Then you take them down. Because now they're trying to get nukes. And they have ICBMs. And they are sending satellites into space. They are gaining the technology necessary, not because they're smart enough to invent it. They're stealing it and they're buying it. From the Chinese, the Russians, and the North Koreans. This is amazing, this statement. This is remarkable, this statement. I can't think of another presidency. I can't think of a prime ministership in Europe where they would say it's unrealistic to tell this country to stop terrorizing us. And we need to get this deal through. My God, folks. Look what's happened. Look what's happening. And the Republicans in the Senate, I think unanimously, just agreed that they have no intention of voting on this. They have no intention of asserting their power as the majority in the Senate, which requires 2/3 of the senators present to approve a treaty, and that's what this would be. It's not some side arrangement. It's not some insignificant foreign policy arrangement. This is a major league treaty. And they want to be able to tell you, their constituents, that they stood up, that they're going to oversee this. Ladies and gentlemen, other than going on radio and TV and whining like stuck pigs, which is what they do when Obama runs circles around Congress and usurps the Constitution, they won't be able to do anything. They just agreed. They just agreed to a filibuster-proof anti-sanction regime. They've just agreed to a veto-proof anti-sanction regime where now it's the Republicans in Congress who need a supermajority to undo what Obama's doing, rather than Obama needing a supermajority in the Senate for Senate approval of a treaty. They've made it more difficult Not even a simple majority vote. They've made it more difficult to stop this. Bob Corker and Lindsey Graham have shown that they can govern. They've shown there's bipartisanship. What we have, what Jefferson calls this, what Alexis de Tocqueville calls this, what Charles de Montesquieu calls this, is an elective tyranny. These men and women have no intention of complying with the Constitution. It's about positioning. It's about public relations. It's about legacy. It's about re-elections. It's about incumbency. It's about money. But it's not about America, the well-being of the country. It's not about restoring our constitutional system. None of it. None of it. And we have become a joke to our enemies. Today, Obama has announced, wow, surprise, surprise, Cuba comes off the terrorist list. While he's emptying Guantanamo Bay. While he's giving aid and comfort to the Islamo-Nazi regime in Iran. Now, let me ask you another question. So Putin is selling these cutting-edge, advanced missile batteries, defensive missile batteries, that have as their purpose to take out jets, fighter bombers. He's selling them to the Iranians, or they're bartering. I believe they're getting 500,000 barrels of oil or whatever the deal is. Tell me something, ladies and gentlemen. Since your Senate has just agreed that this matter will be resolved ultimately in the UN Security Council, since there's not going to be an up or down vote on this in the Senate, tell me, even if the administration were to take the position that sanctions should be reimposed, how do you think Russia's going to vote on the Security Council, having now sold by way of barter the most advanced missile defense systems known to the Iranians? Do you think the Russians are going to uphold their end of the bargain, whatever this bargain is and becomes? Of course not. They're in business now with the Islamo-Nazi regime in Tehran. They're in business with them to sell them advanced missile batteries to be used against the United States or Israel or any of the Arab countries that decide that Iran needs to be attacked. So Russia has no intention of ever triggering sanctions or snap inspections or any of the rest of it. And your Republican Senate just went along with this whole thing. Your Republican Senate, in essence, is going to vote to surrender, to abandon its treaty power, and to grant power unconstitutionally to the UN Security Council. That's what all this means. I think that's why you come to this program, so I can walk you through this. And tomorrow, hopefully, the backbenchers will finally figure this out, having listened to this program. Because today, most of them are befuddled. They don't know what to think. It's a matter of first principles. It's a matter of looking at the Constitution. It's a matter of knowing about separation of powers. It's also a matter of knowing about the deviousness and diabolical nature of this administration. About the impotence and timidity and passivity of the Republicans. One last time, Josh Earnest, cut one, go.
We've had what I could describe as four specific concerns with the way the Corker legislation was introduced. The one that I've talked the most frequently about in public is the requirement for the administration to certify that Iran has not backed terrorism against Americans. And this idea that we could essentially get Iran to renounce terrorism is unrealistic.
I have never, ever in my life, and I bet you haven't either, heard a spokesman for a president so cavalierly say that this administration, that the commander-in-chief, that the armed forces of the United States under this commander-in-chief considers it unrealistic to require a nation that we're negotiating with, to forswear terrorism against us. Which shows you how insane this entire project is and was from the start. And then, barely able to control his giggles, barely able to control his excitement over the fact that the Republicans once again have done an enormous disservice to this country. Cut 2, go.
The proper role for Congress in this effort is the consideration of the sanctions that Congress put in place themselves.
Now stop. See, he's saying that's it. That's all Congress can do. You consider the sanctions you put in place. And by the way, under the Corker deal, you're never going to be able to reimpose them unless you get 60 votes at a minimum. And if you get those, you're going to need 67 votes to override my president's veto, says Ernest, in essence. So even that they're not going to be able to do. But now they just told the administration, you need not submit this treaty to the Senate for an up or down vote. Go ahead.
And again, if we're able to reach a compromise, which seems to be emerging through the committee, the compromise would set
It's not a compromise, it's a surrender. An absolute capitulation. That's why Barbara Boxer supports this. That's why Obama's going to sign this. That's why this man is gleeful. Go ahead.
To vote later on those specific congressional sanctions.
So they would check a box, essentially, to say that, well, it's not an up or down vote anymore on the deal? Is that what
that's correct. It would not be an up or down vote on the deal.
See how thrilled he is? No, it would not be an up or down vote on the deal. It will not be an up or down vote on the deal. Cut 3, go.
What we have made clear to Democrats and Republicans in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee is that the President would be willing to sign the proposed compromise that is working its way through the committee today.
He keeps calling it a compromise. It's a surrender. And of course Obama will sign this. Because he gets everything he wants. A supermajority vote required to reimpose sanctions. So all the Democrats have to do is filibuster. Or threaten the filibuster. And then if they get it through, he will veto it. They don't have 67 votes to override his veto. And then you'll hear Mitch McConnell on TV and the other pathetic, phony leaders of the Republican Party say, there's nothing we can do. He's the president. There's nothing we can do. And you know what? He's right. There's nothing he can do. Because he's a coward and a fraud. They've surrendered the power of the purse. They've surrendered impeachment. Yes, they've surrendered the power over immigration and naturalization. And now they've surrendered the treaty power. I don't think there's anything less to surrender. Maybe they need to take another recess. This capitulation is a lot of hard work. They have given up. They have given up any effort to uphold the Constitution, and I know why. It's because they hope if Jeb Bush becomes president or somebody akin to him, that they will abuse their powers too. The Republican Party, people need to understand, the Republican Party today is not the party of Reagan. The Republican Party today is not a pro-Constitution or pro-free market capitalism party. The Republican Party today is about corporatism, crony capitalism. The Republican Party today is about small men and women who seek to retain power for as long as they can and wield the power not for good, but against anybody who challenges their incumbency. That's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with the Roman Senate, if you will. Rome burns, and they're fighting with each other.
Mark Levin.